Daniel chapter 4. Not endorsing horror movies, but I used to like them a lot growing up. And when I grew up in the 80s, there was several serial movies that it just was the villain would be killed, and then miraculously at the end he'd survive, and there'd be another sequel. But there was one movie that I really liked. It was called A Silver Bullet. It was a werewolf movie. I'm talking about this for a reason. And the reason I like it, I watch it every year. At the end, they kill the werewolf, and he never came back. And it's like 35 years ago. There's never been a sequel. So that was one movie that had complete closure. And we're going to talk about something like another werewolf today. What happened to King Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. So if you followed us through the last 3 weeks, he's been the focus of a lot of this. And today's the last we'll hear from him in Daniel. So as a brief summary, the first 6 chapters of Daniel are basically his life story. Each of the first 4 chapters, the last 3 have some kind of focus on King Nebuchadnezzar. Now for the 3rd time now, the Lord is going to dramatically reveal himself to the king, but this time he's going to face consequences. So the Lord has been giving him warning, and showing himself to him. So we'll begin in Daniel chapter 4, 1-3. Nebuchadnezzar the king, and to all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show you the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Alright, so these first 3 verses are written after the fact of the entire chapter. So I think it's kind of like, anyone ever seen the movies, it shows somebody, he's either let me half dead or something, and someone comes, what happened, said, well, it all started out, and then they flash back, and basically the whole movie works up to that point. I remember my dad saying he never liked those kind of movies. Even one of the most famous movies of all time, I don't know if any of you have seen Citizen Kane, the old classic movie, and he makes this quote on his deathbed, a rosebud, and everybody's like, well, what does that mean? And then it flashes back to and explains, that. Well, this is kind of like this here. If they were to make a movie after chapter 4, maybe Nebuchadnezzar will be back on his throne, and he's saying, this is the events that unfolded over the last few months, which have brought me into the place where I am today. So let's continue reading 4-9. Nebuchadnezzar was at rest, Nebuchadnezzar, so he's talking about himself now, was at rest in mine house and flourishing in my palace. And here he has another dream. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. Sounds familiar if you remember a couple weeks ago. Then came in the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, and I told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. Again, very, very similar to chapter 2. But at the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, and that no secret troubleth thee, tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof. So Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, like he did in chapter 2 of the statue. All right, he's troubled by it, and like in chapter 2, he calls for his wise men. I don't know if he's gained wisdom or he's less of a tyrant in his older age, but he hasn't put that ultimatum out. Tell me what it is, interpret it, or you die. He just asked them, can you tell me what this dream means? And then, I don't know how many years have passed since chapter 2, Maybe saw it comes again. Maybe Daniel is in charge of some province or something. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't have access to him and remembers, oh yes, I remember that dream I had many years ago of the great image and of the giant statue, and Daniel revealed that to me. So I guess he is, so he says, I'm going to call Daniel in, and perhaps he can interpret the dream. And notice his insight. It still seems like he's struggling with many gods back to verse 8, but at last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy God. So here he's still calling gods plural with a small g. So maybe he still hasn't quite got the revelation of who God is, although he certainly had enough chances. So he calls Daniel Belteshazzar, which is his Babylonian name, recognizes his ability to interpret dreams, and so he's going to tell Daniel what he's dreamed. And we'll read about that now in verses 10 through 12. So Nebuchadnezzar, remember the statue that I really, today we just got to, I'm going to test my drawing skills again. We'll just think of a massive tree, maybe a California redwood or something. Wow, that's a little simpler. I believe it has many branches on it, and they're all for a sign. This is the dream Nebuchadnezzar has. Thus were the visions of my head. In my bed I saw, behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached into heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelled in it, and the boughs thereof, and all the flesh was fed of it. Let me offer a theory that I think is kind of unique to me. I don't think I've heard anyone teach this before. In Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of the giant statue, and the Lord revealed the future plans: a head of gold, arms of silver, waist of brass, legs of iron. In the next chapter, we see Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue, and maybe pride got into his heart and said, he said, wow, God, I must be special. Daniel's God has chosen me, and he makes an image maybe similar to that. Maybe the Lord changes it to a tree this time, so it's something natural, so it's something really Nebuchadnezzar can't duplicate. I don't know if that is the reasoning behind it, but it's also to prove an illustration, as we see as we go further into the dream. Verse 13 and 18 tells the content of the dream. I saw in the vision of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and a holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, hew down the tree, and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump, his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, and the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beast and the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's hearts be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basis of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation, but thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. All right, not really sure how to interpret a dream. I would think if I'd had that, my first thought was it's not good, from the things in there. All right, so imagine a tree. So it says there's all kinds of fruits here from the tree. It says birds perch in the tree. animals, beasts lie at its. So it's a gigantic tree. Then Nebuchadnezzar has tree. Let me go with my video graphics here. And he's told to cut the tree down, or cut it and just leave the base of the tree. So this massive thing that had leaves and stuff provided shade. There's nothing left now but a tree and its stump. Then of course it said something was with the sun and the moon pass over it. I guess not moon, because that's not every 7 times. And Daniel's mind begins to think, plus being anointed by the Lord. Nebuchadnezzar begins to reveal the dream. He's troubled by it, and you can see why, because it's not really pleasant elements in the dream. Though at times Nebuchadnezzar can be a tyrant, like I said, he also has showed reverence and respect for the God of the Bible. When Daniel interpreted the dream in chapter 2, he promoted him and his friends. Last week, chapter 3, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't bow before the king, and the Lord delivered them, then he proclaimed, the God of the respect for the God of Israel. So maybe the Lord sees that in his heart and says, I'm about to do something to this king, but I'm going to give him a warning and give him one more shot, to get his life straight. If not, there's going to be consequences. And Daniel is about to reveal the dream. And I'm sure one thing Nebuchadnezzar knows, Daniel is a straight shooter, and what he tells him, he believes, and that's what he believes the Lord has given to him. So the interpretation comes. 19 through 22. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. The king spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. So I guess you can see it on his face that he knows it's not good. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. So Daniel knows something bad's about to happen. He's saying, I hope this doesn't happen to you, but this happen to your enemies. The tree that thou sawest, which grew, was strong, whose height reached into the heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwell, and upon whose branches the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. So he's going over all the stuff that Nebuchadnezzar said that are now gone now. It is thou, O king, thou art grown and become strong. So like the image of the statue, the head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar. This entire tree represents him. It says, For thy greatness is grown and reachest unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. All throughout the ages, it seems like one empire really is in charge of the world. First there was Egypt, then they usually rule as Assyria. Next is Babylon, and now Babylon's ruling the world. Nebuchadnezzar's king of Babylon. So at this time, he's probably the mightiest man on the earth. Now, we would probably think the most powerful man on the earth is the President of the United States. Isn't that an encouraging thought this morning? Who currently occupies that position. But maybe he'll have a werewolf experience and turn him around. But anyway, so verse 22 is, Thou, king, thou art grown and become strong, and for thy greatness is grown and reachest unto heaven, and the dominion to the end of the earth. And whereas the king saw a watcher and a holy one coming down from heaven, and saying, Hew the tree down and destroy it, yet leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass and the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 times passed over. So Daniel has repeated the dream, but he's also made the first point clear, this tree is you. So now he's going to tell him what are all these things that happened to the tree mean. So we're waiting for the big line, the interpretation. Verse 24, This is the interpretation, O king, And this is the decree of the Most High, which is come upon my lord the king, that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling place shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou knowest the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee, after that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. All right, Daniel reveals what the dreams mean. If the king does not humble himself, he faces judgment. This is a classic example that consequences are coming, but at the moment, the king seems to accept it. Most kings of that era, if a wise man said something he didn't like, he just carted him off and we never see him again. But I'm sure he has great respect for Daniel, and he probably believes in all his heart, if Daniel has this interpretation, exactly like he did in chapter 2, this is going to happen. So he takes heed, and it kind of reminds me, I thought of the example of the convicted sinner in church. The pastor gives a really, message on sin. If you're not right with the Lord, you need to come and give your heart to him. He's listening intently, maybe squeezing the white knuckle, they say, holding the pews, and really under conviction. But he's just waiting and can't get his nerve to take that step up and go down to the altar. And then the service passes over, maybe thinks about it, says, that was true what he said, maybe even the next day or two, and then time begins to fade, and it goes out of his mind, he or she, and then he doesn't repent and turn from his wicked ways. And that seems to be what happens to Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sure at the moment Daniel, we released him and walked out of the throne room, he probably sat there on his throne, maybe thought about it, said, there's some things wrong in my life and I need to turn that around. I gotta work on that. And then the affairs of life begin to come back, and quickly Nebuchadnezzar forgot. We'll see what happens here. All right. Verse 28. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. So it's a year later. He's probably forgotten all about this, it's passed in his mind. He never even considered about it. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of thy kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? So he's prideful, he's arrogant, he's, like I said, most powerful person on earth, and he's saying, look what I have done. I have done this, I have made this mighty kingdom. He's forgotten the warning from the Lord. And then verse 31 says here, while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. And they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, as his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. All right, so I'm sure they're kind of like, just giving examples there. Just imagine all at once Nebuchadnezzar is gone, looks like completely insane. And one of my Bible commentaries, I meant to bring it here, says there is some kind of condition where men can take almost like a wolf-like state in insanity. I'm sure them in that day probably had long hair and a beard anyway, but all of a sudden, he just becomes unkept, starts behaving like an animal, and you can imagine what the rulers of the kingdom, when they walk in, expect to see their king sitting on the throne, and he's acting like a person who is insane. So I imagine they have to get together and say, well, we've got to contain him. We've got to put him in a place somewhere where the people can't see him. They can't see the king behaving like this. So who knows what they did with them? It's a big empire. They maybe had a home out in the country or something. They just locked him up with, and maybe I'm actually saying maybe here, it's speculating because it wasn't permanent. They had someone rule in his place because this had happened, and so it's kind of an ironic example. The Lord put him in that place of power. He warned him, this is for me, humble yourselves, repent. Nebuchadnezzar didn't, and then the Lord just gives an example. Let me show you who's in charge of this world. So you said this is done by your power and by your hand, and all of a sudden you're acting like an animal. So I'm going to show you, I'm the one who's in charge of this world. I put you in power, and when I want to, like now, I can take you out of power. So for the next, it says, back to verse. Seven times shall pass over. The interpretation is probably 7 years. So for 7 long years, Nebuchadnezzar is not sitting on his throne of Babylon. He's off acting like an animal, probably looking hideous and fearful. Everyone doesn't know what to do. Maybe this thing he'll probably be insane for the rest of his life. He had the warning. He didn't heed the warning, and now he's facing the consequences. So sometimes people get warnings and they ignore them, and eventually they end up in destruction. Sometimes people turn around before they heed the warning. And then sometimes people face consequences, but the Lord uses the consequences to allow them to come to their senses. And we can look back in our life and say, why did I have to go through that? Sometimes there's no answer. Sometimes we're like, well, I kind of dug that hole for myself, and had I not done that, maybe I would not have, had to go through this. Maybe the Lord allowed this to happen in my life because of decisions I've made. That's not always the answer, but sometimes here, and definitely in Nebuchadnezzar's case, he didn't heed to the warning of the Lord, and the Lord poured out his judgment on him, and as you saw, it was severe. All right, continue reading. Verse 34. So what happens here? What's the result of all this? And at the end of the days, all right, Nebuchadnezzar again is speaking. He says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes into heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. So say this is a movie. It starts with Nebuchadnezzar. This is what happened. We have the flashback, and the last scene is Nebuchadnezzar rolling on a floor of dirt or something like that, and acting like an animal. And then it flashes forward back to the scene again, and we're back to present time, and Nebuchadnezzar is explaining what has happened. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes into heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. So it seems like he finally got the point, but granted he had to go through some horrible things, but it looks like he is finally recognizing the God of heaven. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven. So just think back a few verses later, he's saying, look at this kingdom that I have created. Now he says, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will. So he's saying God's in charge of this in the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand, or say unto him, what dost thou? At the same time my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Perhaps those who are in charge of him, who will go in maybe and feed him every day, and finally walk in one day and just see him maybe sitting in the corner, quiet, not growling or rolling around or making noises, and seeing the miraculous transformation that Nebuchadnezzar's sanity had been restored, And I'm sure after a few days they said, well, it looks like he's back to normal. Let's restore him to the kingdom. What's the purpose of all this? Well, the final verse of the chapter closes out. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. So at long last, it seems like Nebuchadnezzar finally gets the point. Daniel 2, he has a dream, can't remember it. Daniel miraculously tells him the dream, tells him what the dream means, and he's just amazed and gives glory to the God of heaven, but forgets about it. Next chapter, he builds a statue, says anyone who doesn't bow before the statue is going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't bow down. They're thrown into the fiery furnace, and we have that miracle of them walking around with the fourth man in the fire. After they come out, he gives glory to the God of heaven. Next chapter again, he has this dream of this massive tree. Daniel pronounces judgment is coming unless you change. He seems receptive to it, ignores it, and then a year later it finally happens to him. So after the third time, he finally seems to get it. So was Nebuchadnezzar a believer, a follower of the true God? Will he be in heaven when we go up there? I tend to believe he will. It seems like he finally got the message. This is the last we hear from him. Is the next ruler, Belshazzar, which I believe is his grandson, follows in his footsteps. This will be many years later. So we have to hope here. So, like I did last week, we related to the story of 3 men in the fire, and we related that to healing and the Lord's will to healing tonight. Or today, I'd like to kind of take the contents of this chapter and talk a little bit about God's sovereign plan, our free will, things of that nature. If you've heard me a couple times in church, in the Protestant faith, which we are, we're not Catholic, there's kind of two branches, Calvinism and Arminianism. Calvinism believes in predestiny, God, that we're all doomed for, just a basic summary, we're all doomed for destruction, and in God's sovereignty, he has chosen a few people to be saved. If he has chosen you, you can't resist it. You will be saved, you have no say over the matter. Whereas Arminianism is like believes in free will. God's sovereign, but he gives you a choice, and so the big question arises, was this all just a divine plan of God? He rose up Nebuchadnezzar, he allowed him to be wicked, he put him down, he brought him back again. I believe we can see both elements of God's ultimate plan, but free will here as well. Nebuchadnezzar rose to power. I'm sure the Lord had his hand upon him, and I'm sure leaders all over the world, the Lord watches from a child, and maybe he opens doors for them, maybe allows the natural things to happen, but I believe he does allow us to make our own choices. And now, if you're going to do something that's going to, ruin his plan, he's not going to allow that to happen. But if we decide to do something wrong, we're free to do so. Any of us here are free to go out and commit any act of wickedness that we want to. There's nothing that's going to magically stop us. The difference is, how do we handle it? As Daniel is interpreting this dream to Nebuchadnezzar, it seems like he's warning him, saying, you don't have to go through this. This doesn't have to happen. What did it say when he told Daniel that it's going to happen? Verse 27, wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. I always get a lot of questions when I do this online missionary things, saying if God knows everything, why does it matter? It's already predetermined what I do. And I always use this. I don't know if I've used this in the class before or not, because I don't know if its titles come up. If I use the example of if you go to a dinner and you have two choices, if I use it like say you're going to a dinner tonight, and you have a choice of beef or chicken this evening. Right now you don't even know when you get there, you'll make the decision. It's totally yours to make, but the Lord knows what you're going to make. He knows your decision you're going to make. So the point is, you're totally free to make it, but that doesn't mean he doesn't know. But just because he knows the outcome doesn't mean we're free to execute, as we will. So that's kind of, hope I don't get too complicated there in this area. So let's look at world leaders. Does the Lord raise them up and put them down? I believe absolutely. When we go through these great nations, it seems like there's a few leaders that stand out. The first mighty nation in the string of line of Egypt. You think of Pharaoh, the wicked king, and sure the Lord rose him up. There you get into issues of God hardening his heart. But as you follow the pattern, it seems like it starts with Pharaoh hardened his heart. Then as it progresses, then it says the Lord hardened his heart. Maybe when the Lord knows, when he sees the Pharaoh is not going to change no matter what, then he allows him for his great plan to do even more wicked things, which in the end turns out good for the children of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar is most known as Babylon. Cyrus, Darius, the next Medes and Persians, one Cyrus gives a decree to go back and to build the wall of Jerusalem, and his name is in a prophecy hundreds of years before he was born, so the Lord knew he was going to be ruler, and he used him in that area. Then we have the Greek Empire and Alexander the Great, Romans and the emperors there, and how the Lord uses world leaders. So what about today's terms? He saw Hitler coming. He allowed him to come to power, but he also allowed him to be taken down, and probably, the horrible things he did to the Jewish people, probably the result of that was them getting back to their nation, because 3 years after World War II, they were back in their homeland. He does allow tyrants to do horrible things, to kill people, but in the end, they're eventually cut off and judged, and usually it's to bring about his great purpose. We look at our country now, in the realm of politics. I did not think Joe Biden was going to win the presidency. The night after they said he won, I still didn't think it, and was hoping above hope that, the Lord was going to perform a miracle. I didn't even watch the inauguration, and I haven't. Maybe it's because I've basically quit watching news. It just doesn't seem like he's president. It's just a strange feeling. It doesn't even think it's real. And what was the Lord's plan? Of course, we all know Donald Trump had his flaws, but the things that he enacted were all, if you list Christian principles and values and what the church wanted, they would all be on Trump's side. You listen to Biden, everything he did is almost anti-Christian, so it's a no-brainer who would a believer vote for, although not all of them did, and yet the Lord allowed Biden to win. Did he win illegally? I strongly convinced he did. Yes. And a lot of people do, and some of the people raise the question, it's a terrible thing to question democracy or the legitimacy of an election. I said, yeah, but isn't it even worse if it wasn't legitimate? So what they're saying is some of these Republican congressmen are like chastising the president for questioning, but suppose, what he says is true and it wasn't legitimate. There's nothing more that undermines a country if you can't trust a leader. So we knew the Lord raised up President Trump. He served one term. Will he serve another? That's still possible.
Yes.
Then you also have the option. I was watching one of the prophets who strongly believe Trump will be back, and someone, the comments are underneath. Someone said, well, maybe he won't. Maybe this is just the end time scenario. And then sometimes the thought comes to me, are we getting what we deserve here in America? Is this the end? Under a Biden administration, not him personally, because he's not really aware, but under the Democratic platform, hostile to Christianity. All my life I've heard, we've had religious freedom in this country. Will this be the beginning of the end of it? If the people who are in control and behind him have what they want to accomplish, then this will happen. Our freedoms will be limited. in speech. We won't be able to speak out against things that we believe are wrong, like abortion or especially same-sex marriage and things of that nature. And they have control over things. They'll begin to take things from you and say, if you do this thing, you won't be able to do this and you won't be able to do that. So what we do as believers, we know eventually the Lord's going to come. He's got his plan that this will end. It could be very soon. We don't know. Maybe it's not. Whatever the case. When that happens, there's not much we can do then. You know, his will is going to fall out. The events of Revelation that we talked about are going to occur. Until then, we can keep working, praying for the Lord to put godly people in charge, do our part to spread the word, give messages, things of that nature. So if he raises up a person, you know, in my prayer time, when if I pray for the president and vice president, I say, Lord, remove them. But I said, if you can change their heart, change them. That'd be one thing. I view it as almost impossible. But, you know, I've said, if you change them, then that's a different case. If not, somehow remove them from that position. Whether it's a natural way 4 years later when someone else is elected, or through some other means, like, you know, having them removed for some act that they've committed or something comes out from their past. But whatever the case, the Lord's is in charge of all rulers. He has a great plan, but at the same time, he allows, I believe, us to make our own decisions and the events of earth, you know, so it's kind of like a balance. He gives us free will, lets the people have who they choose. The king, think of King Saul, it wasn't time for a king. That wasn't his plan. The people wanted it. He said, all right, I'm going to give you a king. But, you know, it's not time. As a result, they suffered for some of the decisions that Saul made. David was his chosen person to bring the Messiah. I believe David would have had a much better life had he not sinned with Bathsheba. Read the last 20 years of his life, one miserable thing after the other. The Lord still accomplished his plan through it, but because of David's choices, he allowed him to face the consequences. So that's what I kind of want to end it on this week. These last couple weeks I've tried to like interline the events of the chapter with like modern day events. Next week we have another example I can probably use of divine judgment that will eventually come. Sometimes we hear warning and warning and warning over years, but in chapter 5 next week, the warning comes suddenly, and the judgment comes right behind the warning. So, any questions anyone have from today's Daniel 4 or some of the other things that we talked about?
No, I was just thinking that you know, back when Joshua led the Israelites back into the Promised Land, that Lord, when they went out to conquer these different lands, that the Lord said, do not leave anybody standing and do not, you know, just
Right.
to purge the land. Otherwise, it would become a thorn in your side. And it just seems that when we read Kings and we read the other books, that is happening.
Their names keep popping, those nations keep popping up where they didn't.
Where they go to the Lord, they repent, and they are back to worshiping Baal. And had they done what the Lord had said,
Right.
they would not have.
Yes.
They would not have fallen in
I think that's a classic example.
Yeah.
So he will help us, but you know it's up to we have a say in this fight. We're not just robots walking around. He's saying, you know, the choice is yours. How much you want me to work into your life? And they didn't take out all the nations, and they dealt with them until finally they were taken into captivity. See,
Right.
and so for on and off for hundreds of years.
And it's kind of a scary thought if you run parallels between there and now. Then now is will we be carried off into sort of Babylon if we allow the government to stay the course and
Right.
not
Yes.
tell the government what we want.
That's what just got me this one. It seemed like more than ever Christians were praying, more than ever they were speaking, and I was like, what else more could they have done? So it makes you wonder, is it too late now? So we'll just have to keep praying and keep doing our part, and then just allow the Lord
So if you look at the Bible, I think the messages are there, and you pull these messages, just not the Old Testament.
Right.
It's just not, no longer relevant. It is relevant.
Oh, yeah.
And these things we need to pull from the Bible and learn from
Right.
them and apply them to today.
People are people, no,
Yeah.
no matter when they lived.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
In verse 17, so this matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones. Who is the watchers?
That I don't know. Got to do a little research on that. The Holy One, we assume, would be the Lord.
Yeah, I would say that would be the Trinity.
Angels? I don't know. That's bad. It sounds like, it'll be someone supernatural, and if it's not God, so.
Following it through the chapter, they all have a capital W.
Well, when you go back to the Old Testament in Revelation and Genesis, and you hear about the fallen angels, and weren't the watchers kind of like the angel Gabriel and Michael and a few others that went to God and said, hey, we've got all this evil going on the earth, and with giants and.
Well, Gabriel will have a later say in this chapter, so it could be a connection to that, so.
Okay. And what about 7 times? What does that mean?
I assume he's 7 years.
7
That's what
years.
most of the interpretation had.
Okay.
So Nebuchadnezzar was acting like that for 7 years,
Okay.
acting like an animal. That'll humble you.
Yeah.
I think that was the direct perfection of the Lord's hand in his life. That
Yeah.
7 years, because 7
And
years
7
stands
was-
for
And that 7 will come up again in Daniel with the 70th week, so.
This was 15 years later in his life. It was just about a year before he had he burnt Jerusalem. About a year before he went insanity. And he gave him 12 months to.
Yeah, he had
To
plenty of
repent.
time to repent, so there's your example. The Lord was merciful, but
Yeah, give
time
him a whole
comes
year.
when he says, that's enough.
Don't you think that, when we read this chapter about especially Nebuchadnezzar and the other nations, that God was not just the Israelites, his people, but also that he would groom nations, and he was
Yeah, it was
trying
like-
to get
yeah.
nations to come to God,
Like
and come to him as well.
Impressions it would have to make on Pharaoh and on Nebuchadnezzar and on Darius, and seeing Daniel coming out of the lion's den. If he goes to the leader, hoping I guess maybe trickle down
Yeah,
to the nations, and so there's evidence even before the church that in the Old Testament the Lord is trying to reach out to all people.
The
And
Gentile
finally, when the church
nations.
comes,
yeah.
then they're really fully grafted in. But there's always King Esther and what happened, with Esther and the king there. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's pray, Lord. Thank you for the lesson today. Be with us this morning, and Lord.